In 2019, the economist Martin Weitzman committed suicide. Weitzman was one of four recent high-profile suicides in the economics profession, along with Alan Kruger, Emmanuel Fahy, and William Sandholm. All of these men were considered top economists. Weitzman was a professor at Harvard who narrowly missed out on the Nobel in 2018. Alan Kruger was at Princeton and had worked at the White House under Obama. The Economics Nobel Prize in 2021 was awarded to many of Kruger's co-authors, and he surely would have received it had he lived. Emmanuel Fahy was only 41, but was already tenured at Harvard. He was an up-and-coming economist who was widely regarded. William Sandholm was a professor at the University of Wisconsin and a well-respected game theorist, who was again young, only 50. These four suicides, all of which took place in 1 year, raised serious questions about the environment in the economics profession. Why do some of the most respected, accredited, and accomplished members of the profession want to take their own lives? Suicide is a complicated topic, and it would be wrong to assume that only one thing was responsible for any given suicide. Undoubtedly, each of these men had things going on that none of us know about. But in the case of Weitzman, observers drew clear links between his suicide and his professional status. Weitzman was a climate change economist, known for the dismal theorem. This is the idea that the outcome of climate change is potentially so terrible that by any sensible calculation, we should invest everything we can to prevent it now. In 2018, William Nordhaus, another climate change economist who was more sanguine about its consequences, won the Nobel Prize. The committee made the strange decision to pair Nordhaus with an economist from a different area, Paul Romer, who was a macroeconomist focused on technological change, rather than a climate change economist. It's not usual for the prize to be awarded to economists from two separate fields. It has been reported that even Nordhaus himself was surprised by this pairing. When he found out he'd won, he asked, "Did they not also give it to Marty?" Whatever the Nobel Committee's reasons, narrowly missing out on the Nobel seems to have been a big factor in Weitzman's mental health. The New York Times reported,
Colleagues said that Professor Weitzman had grown increasingly despondent after being passed over for the Nobel Prize in Economics last year, and had left a note questioning whether he any longer had the mental acuity to contribute to his field.
What I want to explore in this video are the features of the toxic culture in economics which led to this kind of situation. This video is motivated by making the field of economics a better place so that things like this no longer happen. But I'm going to warn you, the video is not always sympathetic to practices in economics, or powerful actors within the profession, and that's for very good reason. Economics has been called the king of the social sciences. It's not especially difficult to find comments from economists proclaiming the superiority of their field. For example, one well-known paper by Edward Lazear has the following abstract.
Economics is not only a social science, it is a genuine science. Like the physical sciences, economics uses a methodology that produces refutable implications and tests these implications using solid statistical techniques. In particular, economics stresses three factors that distinguish it from other social sciences. Economists use the construct of rational individuals who engage in maximizing behavior. Economic models adhere strictly to the importance of equilibrium as part of any theory. Finally, a focus on efficiency leads economists to ask questions that other social sciences ignore. These ingredients have allowed economics to invade intellectual territory that was previously deemed to be outside the discipline's realm.
My eyes, the goggles do nothing.
The first paragraph of the paper continues.
By almost any market test, economics is the premier social science. The field attracts the most students, enjoys the attention of policymakers and journalists, and gains notice, both positive and negative, from other scientists. In large part, the success of economics derives from its rigor and relevance as well as from its generality. The economic toolbox can be used to address a large variety of problems drawn from a wide range of topics.
Unlike the first quote, this one is correct. In terms of intellectual prestige, political influence, funding, and job opportunities, economics is one of the best degrees or PhDs you could hope for. The result of all this is, to be blunt, that the field is institutionally arrogant. There are quite a few high-profile cases of economists invading intellectual territory, as Lazear puts it, but clearly failing to understand the terrain they are invading. They are prone to thinking their skills and abilities give them a license to wade in on any topic that takes their fancy. A recent high-profile example involved economists turning their attention to the opioid crisis in the USA. Over the past decade or so, tens of thousands of people have died from the use of prescription opioids. A controversial way to deal with this is to engage in what's called harm reduction by prescribing the alternative drug of heroin. Although heroin is still harmful, it's less so than the prescription opioids, especially if it's administered by health professionals in a safe and sterile setting. For this reason, many public health experts endorse the harm reduction approach, with systematic reviews of hundreds of studies supporting this conclusion. Unfortunately for the public health experts, a handful of economists decided that this was wrong. The Economist research makes the case that harm reduction will backfire, first by saving the lives of active drug users. Yes, that means one of their arguments is that drug users surviving longer is bad, actually. And second, by increasing the chance of overdose by reducing the costs of using, since better care means less risk. According to this argument, people may take more if they think they'll be cared for when things go wrong, which will result in more overdosing. The research received a lot of criticism, partly because their measure of harm reduction is the passing of legislation, which public health experts pointed out doesn't necessarily translate into the policy being enforced in practice. Additionally, rather than using actual drug distribution or use, they used Google searches of the names of drugs, as well as arrest data, which public health experts pointed out are not the same thing. I'm not against interdisciplinary criticism. Surely there are some areas where economists can help inform public health and vice versa. This is not my area of expertise either, and there's an outside chance the economists could be right about harm reduction. What I want to draw attention to is their attitude. In response to these criticisms of their research, one of the authors, Jennifer Doliak, said,
I find it utterly disheartening that a discipline as important as public health is filled with so many people who collectively have so little understanding of rigorous research methods. Advocates should acknowledge that many of their strongly held priors are not evidence-based. Anecdotes and personal experience are valuable, but are not a substitute for rigorous causal inference methods.
So when investigating opioid addiction, the economists first didn't know about the extensive public health research on the matter. Second, they dismissed out of hand the criticisms from people with more knowledge of the topic than themselves. In fairness to the Brookings Institute, where the paper was published, they said they didn't endorse Doliak's response to the criticism and reaffirmed that public health research was invaluable. But all of this is an extreme version of a more general trend in economics, which aggressively values its own methods above those from other disciplines. Lazear's paper on economic imperialism gives a large number of examples, ranging from sociology to business to law, where economists have imposed their approach on that of other disciplines. One 2015 paper by Fourcade et al. Shows that economics papers do not pay attention to other disciplines as much as other disciplines pay attention to economics papers. This table shows the percentage of academics who agree or strongly agree with the statement, in general, interdisciplinary knowledge is better than knowledge obtained by a single discipline. Economists are the only group who majority disagree with this statement. This table shows the citations from the flagship journals of economics, political science, and sociology to their own disciplines and to the other two. The journals are shown by the different rows on the left-hand side, while the places they cite from are across the columns on the top. Every discipline is more likely to cite itself, as shown by the large numbers down the diagonal line. But there is a clear asymmetry in the citations across disciplines. At the American Economic Review, the top political science and sociology journals are cited less than 1% of the time. 40.3% of citations from the American Economic Review are to the top 25 economics journals, whereas only 0.8% are to the top 25 political science journals. Political science cites top economics journals about 5 times more than the other way round. For sociology, that number is closer to 8 times. A more recent paper by Angrist et al. Confirmed this with more systematic data. This graph shows the percentage of citations from the different social sciences, with economics in solid black. Because the black line is clearly below the green, red, and yellow lines, the graph confirms that economics is insular relative to political science, sociology, and anthropology, respectively. But Angrist et al. Do caveat Fourcade's findings in 2 ways. Firstly, psychology is, curiously, even more insular than economics. The blue line is either at or below the level of the black line. Secondly, economics is becoming less insular, as the black line has risen somewhat over the period. This is evidence of some improvement, which we'll return to towards the end of the video. Fourcade et al. Summarised the superiority of economists.
Thus, most economists feel quite secure about their value added. They are comforted in this feeling by the fairly unified disciplinary framework behind them, higher salaries that many of them believe reflect some true fundamental value, and a whole institutional structure, from newspapers to congressional committees to international policy circles, looking up to them for answers, especially in hard times. In fact, the recent economic and financial crisis has arguably made the discipline of economics as a whole more, not less, visible, and its expertise more sought after. The deep recessions of the early 1980s and the Great Depression of the 1930s had the same effect.
It's a go-kart powered by my own sense of self-satisfaction.
So here we have ingredient number 1 of a toxic discipline, an implicit and often explicit belief that your own approach is superior. I now want to draw your attention to a slightly awkward panel at the American Economics Association entitled The Curse of the Top 5.
Okay, it comes from a paper that I'm writing with Pascal Michéa, and we plan to submit it to a top 5. That's supposed to be a joke, so you don't have to laugh. Okay.
God's sake. Oh my God, George, I've been there, don't worry. All right, let's just leave that. Oh God, it's not even that funny. It's not that funny. Right, so what does the curse of the top 5 mean? Well, another feature of economics is that it's remarkably hierarchical. The field is dominated by the top schools, the top journals, and the top people. Specifically, the curse of the top 5 refers to the top 5 economics journals: Econometrica, the American Economic Review, the Review of Economic Studies, the Quarterly Journal of Economics, and the Journal of Political Economy. Remember that last one. There's strong evidence that being published in the top 5 dictates promotion and tenure positions. People get boosts just for publishing their papers in the top 5, regardless of the quality of the publication. The top 5 becomes an aspiration, especially for younger economists, and not publishing there is seen as a sign of failure. Naturally, most economists do not and will never publish in the top 5, and most that do so will only do it once or twice. Even for those economists published many times in the top 5, if they drop out, it is seen as a sign of professional decline. In essence, it's a losing battle for everyone. If you're outside the top 5, you feel like a loser. If you're inside the top 5, then you're worried you might lose it. I know what some people might be thinking. Hey, aren't the top 5 journals just the best journals? Why is it bad to acknowledge the best work in the profession? Aren't you just bitter that you don't get published in those journals? Maybe you should improve your research instead of... Alright, shut up now. Recently, an episode emerged which may make you doubt the integrity and professionalism at display in this process. Jim Heckman is an editor of the Chicago-based Journal of Political Economy, a top 5 journal. He is also someone who has pushed against the curse of the top 5. The economist Kenneth Judd recently posted to his blog the details of his recent submission to the JPE.
The documents below detail the battle I had with JPE regarding a paper I wrote and submitted to JPE in November 2012. Here is the short version. 1. JPE rejected the paper because we did uncertainty quantification, also known as sensitivity analysis. 2. I contacted Jim Heckman regarding this decision, and he told us to change the title, resubmit the paper, and that he would handle the new submission. 3. Heckman said that he would reject the paper if, in public comments and not in the paper, I criticized the JPE editor for the hostility to uncertainty quantification. 4. I obeyed Heckman's gag order while we worked on the revision. However, when we sent the revision to JPE, I took my name off the paper. 5. I contacted the University of Chicago asking if Heckman's threats violated their standards for freedom of speech. The answer from UC was emphatic approval of Heckman's threats. 6. The paper came out in JPE in December 2019. 7. In 2020, I asked JPE if I could publicly display the correspondence regarding this matter. They agreed, and I post the documents below. The emails below showed that many people at UC were aware of this conflict. No one expressed any criticism of how JPE treated this paper. While my comments focus on my emails with Heckman, it is clear that all the people who knew about this fully supported Heckman in his threats. Heckman was merely the chief spokesman of a gang of UC professors and administrators who believe that it is appropriate for a journal editor to use his editorial power to silence those who want to criticize standard economic methodology.
In essence, the paper was rejected because the journal didn't rate a method they used, known as uncertainty quantification. The details of this method are of course far less important than the drama. It seems that Judd felt he had been threatened by Heckman and took his name off the final paper, which is quite a bold move. But why? The journal's initial response to the paper was as follows.
In my first decision letter on this submission, I wrote that I was not optimistic that this process will end well. The initial condition of this paper is just too far away from anything that the JPE would publish. I therefore would understand if you decide to send your paper to a journal with a readership that is more familiar with these models. And if you do decide to resubmit, please include responses to the reviewers. A successful revision would have to convince them as well.
So they are outright telling Judd the paper isn't good enough, but giving him some advice which could help to get it published. Judd's reaction to this was interesting.
You rich people tell the rest of us to be patient. However, where are you when we play by your rules but get our money stolen or have our papers savaged by editors and references because we are not in the right fight club? Time is running out on my academic career. Stanford is downgrading the status of senior fellows. Stanford people control Hoover money and make sure that it goes to Stanford people. If I find it useful to hammer Monica and the Stanford Economics Department, then I will do so. If you want to take this paper, Yang Yang and Thomas hostage, then so be it. I do not negotiate with terrorists. I have held back for 2 years on the RDCEP theft, fearful of what Ian and Lars would do to Yang Yang's financing. I am patient, but there is a limit. I now wish that we had just reopened the old file. It would not have mattered who the acting editor was because, as I told you, I would have brought the entire editorial board into this and this would be settled by now. Thugs run JPE and you don't care. Thanks for the info, Ken.
You may see Judd's email as slightly over the top. Being rejected is horrible, and Heckman has been quite blunt, as were the referees who reviewed the paper if you read the full exchange. It's not difficult to see the career and financial pressures at play on Judd in this email. Time is running out in his academic career. There is no money. There are gatekeepers preventing him operating as he would like. But it takes quite a sense of entitlement to email an editor about a rejection. Journals receive hundreds, even thousands of submissions, and during my PhD we were basically told never to email an editor in this way. There's a vanishingly small chance of it working and it just makes you look bad. Judd is himself an economist at Stanford, which is a top department, like Chicago. Most economists would not have the status or connections to even attempt this kind of decision reversal. In addition, Judd went on to threaten the students of the editorial staff.
I can also play this hostage game. Thomas and Yang Yang are my students. Harold and Monica have students. It makes me sick to write this email, but if that is the game we are playing, then so be it. The big difference is that my criticisms of anybody's work will be scientifically valid. They are threatening to abuse editorial power to silence discussions of legitimate issues. Any harm they do to my students will be on your head.
In response, Heckman also upped the ante.
Ken, I spoke with Harold about your recent string of emails and threats to raise a stink about the handling of your paper in the first round at the JPE. We both agree that it will be exceptionally damaging to the handling of your paper at the journal. We have bent over backward out of deep respect for you. A previous editor, Monica P., rejected a very close draft. At my urging, I convinced Harold to reopen the case against considerable precedent. In fact, there is no precedent I know of. I continue to think your paper has great merit, but don't cause a stink and make a delicate situation much, much worse. It's so counterproductive. What rate of discount do you have to go off on these rants against people who respect you and want to encourage your work? Even if you are suicidal, have you no concern about your co-authors? A revised paper along the lines of my letter will very likely be published. If, however, you continue to rub old sores, we will have to reconsider this decision. However angry you may be, do not destroy a very delicate situation with a rant against Monica. Leave it alone, or leave the JPE. Call me a son of a bitch, an idiot, or whatever you like, but let this act of respect for you and your work not be harmed, and just do what you do best. Wonderful economics.
So Heckman is now saying that Judd should not push this or the paper will be fully rejected. He is threatening Judd right back. At this stage, I'm sure you're all looking forward to Judd's response, so let's get right to it.
The stink portion of my so-called threats to raise a stink would not focus the idiosyncratic details about how she handled the paper, but what was said about economics methodology. In particular, the prohibition on serious and systemic parameter sensitivity analysis, and the requirement that any second-year PhD students in any field of economics should be able to understand the paper. My threats were only telling you that I wanted to engage economics in discussions about substantive issues. Monica's clear statements demonstrated that my criticisms were not hypothetical, but did represent attitudes of at least one powerful editor. I thought you would have been sympathetic, but now you demand silence. I do not stab people in the back. I do not hide behind anonymity in my comments. I make them openly, even signing many of my negative referee reports. I have often suspected retaliation was common at journals, so this does not come as a total surprise. I may be suicidal, but you have hostages. I don't sacrifice young people.
So what is the lesson from this episode? Clearly, the JPE has a lot of power in this situation, and authors aren't being treated very well. But Judd has a clear sense of entitlement and is pushing things quite aggressively, despite facing a rejection that is commonplace in the discipline. My only takeaway is that there are no heroes. There is a competitive and toxic culture at play, which is making people entitled, blunt, bitter, and mean. On top of the insecurity and competitiveness it created by this hierarchical structure, it's just not that great a way to do economics. Despite their huge importance to individual careers, the top 5 journals aren't actually that great an indicator of the quality of papers. Many of the most pioneering papers in economics were published outside the top 5, with unpublished papers also playing an increasing role, as well as books, which are almost entirely disregarded within the economics profession. There is also a degree of nepotism at play in these journals. There is evidence that economists are much more likely to publish in a journal that is associated with their own university. Top schools hire disproportionately from each other. 60% of the faculty at Harvard and MIT did their PhDs at Harvard or MIT. This is a pretty standard human tendency to go with who you know, and it may partially reflect higher quality at certain universities. However, it definitely creates an unfair disadvantage for those outside the club whose likelihood of getting published or getting a job diminishes. There are reports that people at top departments can run their papers by likely editors before actually submitting them to increase their chances of getting published. Concentrating power in the hands of a few editors and schools where the journals are based also ends up catering to the biases of whomever is in charge. As Heckman, yes, that Heckman, and Moktan put it,
monopolies restrict welfare. Oligopolies do little better. Openness and entry promote productivity, innovation, and the introduction of new ideas. Academic economics risks becoming or remaining a group of top 5 plodders, putting one foot in front of the other. Emphasis on the top 5 incentivizes careerism rather than creative scholarship.
So here we have ingredient number 2 of a toxic discipline, an impossibly difficult competition where success, both perceived and real, depends on publishing in a small number of journals. The process of attempting and often failing to get published in these journals turns people into whatever the hell that email exchange was. This is despite the fact that the evidence in favour of this hierarchical system is limited. Now, for the third ingredient of a toxic culture, let's turn to a slightly different issue. Economics has a long-established problem with women. These graphs show the percentage of women awarded degrees across various disciplines, with bachelor's degrees on the right and doctorates on the left. Economics is the thick black line, and you can clearly see it is at the bottom when compared to other disciplines. It hovers around 30% for both ordinary degrees and for PhDs, not showing much progress in recent years. In contrast, women are now the majority in the social sciences, the dashed black line, and in STEM, the thin black line, and in humanities, the yellow line, while they are close to 50% in business, the dotted blue line. These graphs also throw doubt on explanations that revolve around women not liking or being good at maths. Women now choose STEM more than men, and STEM subjects are at least as mathematical as economics. A number of things point to women being unrepresented and undervalued within the profession. Female professors are paid 75% of the salary of male professors. Women account for 13.7% of authorships in economics, around half of the average across the social sciences. Women are less likely to get tenure at their first academic job compared to men, which is no longer the case in other disciplines. The so-called leaky pipeline, where women drop out at every level. Women are 36% of undergraduate economics students, 27% of PhDs, 14% of full professors, and only 2 women have ever won the Economics Nobel Prize. There is also plenty of direct evidence that women face discrimination in economics. The economist Claudia Sahm, a macroeconomist who has previously worked at the Federal Reserve, has become something of a crusader against the toxic culture in the discipline. In 2020, she wrote a viral blog post entitled "Economics is a Disgrace." Much of the post is devoted to particular cases of harassment and abuses within the profession, especially of women and of minorities. To give some examples,
the new woman economist at the board was asked by the men colleagues at lunch if she satisfied her husband.
The woman economics major at Chicago, who went to office hours. She sat on the floor since the room was crowded. Her professor offered her a chair. She said she was fine sitting on the floor. He looked at her and said, "I see you like it on your knees." Women do.
The tenure of a Native American woman economist was revoked after her men colleagues turned on her. I talk with her regularly. We talk about how she could return to academia after she is healthy again. Do you know how many Native American women are economists? Very few. Do you know how many Black economists work at the Fed? 1 out of 406. Economics is a disgrace.
For her efforts, Claudia was summarily fired from the think tank Equitable Growth on the grounds that her blog post put the reputation of equitable growth at risk. Such is the case if you make a stand within our profession. Individually, these are just anecdotes, but together they start to paint a picture which is confirmed by more general surveys and research. The American Economic Association found that half of women say they have been treated unfairly because of their sex, while the same figure for men is 3%. Almost half of women say they have avoided conferences or seminars for fear of harassment. 70% of women said that their colleagues' work was taken more seriously than their own. One paper on the topic looked at how women get less credit for publishing research than men do. In academia, when somebody has published a paper on their own, it's easier to credit them, or blame them if it's me, for what's inside. Publishing with co-authors may dilute your contribution in the eyes of readers and potential employers, and reduce your chance of succeeding relative to publishing solo. Well, it turns out that only women get punished for co-authoring in economics. Men who co-author have just as good a chance of getting tenure as men who author alone, but women who co-author have a reduced chance compared to women who author alone. This is quite possibly because in the absence of information about who contributed what, unconscious biases mean readers assume that men contributed more and that women occupy junior or assistant roles in the research. The study which found this compares the dynamic to sociology, where authors are listed in order of their contribution and where women don't suffer a similar penalty for co-authoring. In an interesting turn of events, this very paper, which was originally circulated as solo authored by Heather Sarson, was eventually published with 3 other co-authors, including 2 men. There are some additions to the published paper when compared to the original unpublished paper. There are some robustness checks which vary how they measure things like tenure and research quality, as well as a couple of kind of relevant experiments added about gender bias. But ultimately, a study by a female author about how women get penalised for co-authoring was eventually published as co-authored, even though the main contribution was clearly hers. I wonder why women don't like economics. Oh, and this was all in the Journal of Political Economy, again. Some of the reasons women avoid economics may be more subtle than direct discrimination and implicate the subject matter itself. Economists often study markets, which means a focus on activities and work which involve money changing hands. Yet historically and still today, women engage in activities such as childcare, housework, and cooking, which are not remunerated directly and therefore have not been noticed as much by economists. Feminist economists have long called for measuring this unpaid labour and integrating it into GDP measures or otherwise reporting it. Female students have been reported to say that they don't choose economics because they did not think that economics was interesting, which is understandable if the subject matter just does not seem relevant to you. This is also backed up by the huge differences in policy opinions between male and female economists, with female economists generally leaning more towards government intervention in economic policy. Men and women are often socialised to see economics differently, and if economists prioritise the male view, it makes sense that women might tend to avoid it. Finally, there are all the little things that deter women, but which men just won't notice unless they're pointed out. For a long time, job interviews in economics have taken place in hotels, where young economists go for short interviews with panels from a number of different universities in the rooms of the hotels. It's even been called speed dating for economists. In other words, if you want a job in economics, you have to go into hotel rooms full of old men you don't know and speed date them for the job repeatedly. I wonder why women don't like economics. In many cases, the interviewees are required to sit on the beds of the men who are interviewing them, and there are numerous stories of the men commenting how lucky they were to have such a beautiful woman in their bed. Excuse me while I vomit. So here we have ingredient number 3 of a toxic culture, a male-dominated discipline which systematically discourages women. To anticipate one objection, am I saying that if economics just had more women, its problems would be solved? Absolutely not. There are many successful women in economics who emulate the worst aspects of its culture. Although this culture may find its roots in a male-dominated environment, it won't budge just by having more women fill the spaces at the top 5 journals. Jennifer Doliak, who, if you recall, we met earlier when discussing the opioid crisis, is a good example of a woman who exemplified the arrogance of the discipline. Her dismissive response to public health experts on the issue of opioid addiction was as bad as anything I've seen from a man. This is despite the fact that she has pushed efforts to bring more women into the discipline, including being rightly enraged by the co-authoring fiasco with the Heather Sarsons paper we saw earlier. Encouraging more women to pursue economics is a good thing, but it's not enough. So, what kind of culture do we get when we combine our 3 ingredients? 1. Insularity and a belief in your own superiority. 2. A hierarchical, competitive and nepotistic internal structure. 3. Dominance by men, with the exclusion of women and minority groups. Toxic masculinity is typically thought of as a set of harmful expectations and norms around what it means to be a man. For example, a typical man may be expected to be a breadwinner.
You know, I put food on the table.
I work hard for the money. So hard for the money.
To be physically strong.
Come on over here and fight like a man.
Fight like a man!
Hey, bully boy, why don't you get out of here before I give you a knuckle sandwich?
Oh, Billy, you are all man. Golly, what a hoe.
All I have to say is goodbye, bag of bones. Hello, hunky meat muscle. Oh, mama.
To be good at sports and other competitions.
So you're not good at sports. It's a very small part of life.
Sports. Bart rides up in the front seat today because he's a good guy at sport.
To be tall.
He's so tall and handsome as hell.
To be romantically successful.
Check out my girlfriend. She's in Canada.
Yeah.
She migrated. She's not made up.
Okay.
Look at her. Look at her. She exists, brah.
To be funny.
Did you ever notice how men always leave the toilet seat up? That's the joke.
You suck, McBain!
To be boisterous, to drink, play poker.
The guys are going to play poker.
Listen, we're going to play a little poker tonight. You boys going?
You play poker?
God, I love poker night.
To engage in locker room talk, which is often derogatory towards women, and to suppress emotions, except for anger.
I'm just passionate, like all us Greeks.
No, you're angry. Look, you're punching the cat right now.
Oh, I am. Oh my God, you're right. I'm a rageaholic. I just can't live without rageaholic.
It goes without saying that few, if any, men actually want to or can do all of these things. In many cases, achieving them is a Sisyphean task. Once you reach your target at the gym, you start comparing yourself to the guys who are benching even more. As a result, many men feel like failures in one area or another, whether that be romantically, career-wise, physically, or socially. You may see where I'm going with this. Economics has a culture analogous to toxic masculinity. Convinced of their own superiority, yet operating in a highly competitive environment which constantly reminds them of their own shortcomings, economists are insecure and eager to prove that they fit into the mold of what it means to be an economist, resulting in a toxic and harmful rat race which is ultimately good for no one, not even those who win. Partly this is natural, right? A male-dominated discipline would be expected to display negative traits associated with toxic masculinity. Philosophy, the only other social science where women are as underrepresented as economics, seems to have similar problems with its culture. But the specific institutional characteristics of economics that we've detailed give rise to some unique elements of toxicity within the economics profession. As discussed earlier, economists are notable for their fairly rigid and unified core framework. Edward Lazear's paper on economic imperialism identified economics as a set of core tools which can and should be applied to any question. How many times have you heard the expression, thinking like an economist? How often do you hear thinking like a sociologist or an anthropologist, or even a physicist? There's no doubt that a clear set of boundaries and practices exist surrounding what it means to be an economist. This is all probably best illustrated through the case study of seminars. It may sound surprising, but economics seminars can actually be quite dramatic and exhausting affairs. Unlike a traditional presentation where questions are saved until the end, people will interrupt from the beginning, often with critical comments. This tends to surprise people from outside academia who already find presentations terrifying. Having senior faculty bark negative comments at you before you've really begun is just par for the course in economics. A New York Times article reported on some research done on economics seminars.
A few years ago, the economists Alicia Sasser-Modestino and Justin Wolfers sat at the back of a professional conference and watched Rebecca Diamond, a rising star in their field, present her latest research on inequality. Or at least she was meant to present it. Moments after she began her talk, the audience began peppering her with questions. She must have gotten 15 questions in the first 5 minutes, including, "Are you going to show us the data?" Dr. Modestino recalled. It was an odd, even demeaning question. The session was in the data-heavy field of applied microeconomics. Of course she was going to show her data. Later that morning, Dr. Modestino and Dr. Wolfers watched as another prominent economist, Aaron Joget-Dubé, presented a paper on the minimum wage. But while that was one of the most hotly debated topics in the field, the audience allowed Dr. Dubé to lay out his findings for several minutes with few interruptions. Over a drink later, Dr. Modestino and Dr. Wolfers wondered, had the audiences treated the two presenters differently because of their genders?
You may remember the names Aaron Dubé and Rebecca Diamond because both of them featured in one of my previous videos where I was more skeptical of Diamond's research than Dubé's. Shit. Now, people have reasonably grown tired of online complaints about men that make gross generalizations. The 6-month furore over manspreading was certainly a colossal waste of time. But you would be hard-pressed to find a better example of mansplaining and even man-tructing than in these economics seminars. It actually reminds me of the Mantage, for those of you who remember that far back into YouTube.
Know it, here's Joe eating me. Good eating. There's Luke crying openly at Old Yeller. Here's Joe debating a topic of importance. Well, there's Luke waking up without hitting the snooze button. Delicious.
Deirdre McCloskey once commented that the number one compliment among economists was to say, "You're smart." In many cases, people in an economics seminar will try to guess at and explain the paper to the presenter early on, as clearly happened with Rebecca Diamond. Conscious or otherwise, this is an attempt to impress everyone with how intelligent you are and how much you understand economics. I've only seen one slide, but I've already guessed the rest, and here's why I know it's wrong after thinking about it for 30 seconds, even though you've been working on it for years. As we all know on Left YouTube, Judith Butler has argued that masculinity is essentially a performance. Many of the male traits we just mentioned, boisterousness, locker room talk, aggressively pursuing women, are a kind of demonstration to other men that you're a part of the tribe. By engaging in these actions, you create your identity as a man. Is it not a performance too, proving your worth in seminars by loudly critiquing papers after a single slide? I have myself been positively reinforced for asking these kinds of questions in seminars. Demonstrating that you belong in economics by doing these economist-y things could be considered analogous to demonstrating that you are masculine by doing manly things. Am I pushing the analogy between gender and economics too far? Probably. Did I understand all of Judith Butler? No. What are you going to do about it? You've already watched most of the video anyway. Returning to Wolfers and Modestino, a great name by the way, they did some systematic research about all this by gathering data from seminars. They found that women were asked about 12% more questions than men, and also that the questions they were asked were more likely to be patronising or hostile. I wonder why women don't like economics. No doubt, there is value in getting critical feedback on your work. In the same New York Times article, the economist Ioana Marinescu, sorry if I've pronounced that wrong, defended the seminar process as stimulating. In my experience, it's rationalised as, if we don't critique your work now, someone else will further down the line, when it's too late. But there are ways of asking questions and critiquing which do not involve overt displays of dominance. And the "it's for your own good" argument can only take us so far. Abusive parents say that. Ultimately, what's to blame is the toxic environment that gives rise to these behaviours. Speaking of which, we are now going to talk about the website Economics Job Market Rumours, or EJMR for short. For those of you blissfully unaware, EJMR is an anonymous internet forum for professional economists. Ostensibly designed for graduate students to anonymously find out information about jobs, it quickly descended into a cesspit filled with the worst tendencies of the discipline and of the internet. On an average day in EJMR, you'll mostly find boring, albeit obsessive posts about how the job market is going, whether this or that journal or school is sufficiently respected to bother with, and complaints about virtually every economist under the sun, from random ones on Twitter to literal Nobel Prize winners. To take a random example,
who is your favourite economist at Oxford?
Mine is David Hendry, for his fundamental contributions to the macroeconomic science.
Mike McCheese, their great new hire. Oh, and Hendry is a joke.
David Hendry is the father of modern macroeconometrics.
Henry is a total loser, completely isolated in the profession. Nobody takes him seriously outside of Oxford. Kidding me? Hendry will kick your ass by getting Nobel in the next 5 years.
And so on. This forum is ridiculous. These are supposedly academics. Supposedly. There's no way of knowing for sure. Observers have compared EJMR to many things, including 4chan, but I think it resembles more closely another niche internet forum, the involuntary celibate, or Incels. Natalie Wynn at ContraPoints has a famous and excellent video exploring incels and their culture.
Short for involuntary celibate. The word incel was invented in the late 90s by a lonely bisexual called Alana, who created a website called Alana's Involuntary Celibacy Project that was essentially a safe space for people who just couldn't get it in. But in our own miserable moment of internet history, the word incel refers to a more specific community of mostly heterosexual men, centered around forums like incel.me and r/braincells. This group has recently gotten a lot of bad press because for the last few years they've been churning out mass murderers faster than Marvel can make Avengers movies.
If incels are the bottom feeders of toxic masculinity, EJMR is the bottom feeder of toxic economics. The parallels are closer than you might think at first glance. For example, incels tend to split the world into alphas, normies, and incels. Alphas are the good-looking guys with strong jaws who get all the girls, while incels are jawless losers who are unable to get a girlfriend. In the middle, normies, who make up the majority of men, must settle for the women that the alphas don't want. Normies are mildly successful in romance, certainly more so than the incels, but are ultimately the target of ire because they are second tier. EJMR have a strangely analogous way of seeing the world. They like to separate people into categories too, but the terms they use are HRMs, MRMs, and LRMs. HRM stands for High Ranked Monkey, which is short for someone who is at a top school and publishes in the top 5 journals. MRM stands for Medium Ranked Monkey, someone at a slightly inferior school who might publish in the top 5 journals from time to time. LRM stands for Low-Ranked Monkey, people at schools which are not highly regarded and who will not get into the top 5 or even top 10 journals. There are countless threads on the forum asking which universities belong in which category, and in keeping with the hierarchical nature of the discipline, there's not much space in the top 2 tiers of HRM and MRM. Most people are in the LRM category. This differs from the incels because in their taxonomy, the bottom is in the minority, while most men sit in the middle as normies. But that's not the most important point here. ContraPoints concludes that the incel movement is basically just a vehicle for self-hatred. Although hatred is directed outwards, especially towards people who don't conform to traditional standards, there's also a lot of hatred directed inwards. Consider the opening clip from ContraPoints' video.
Imagine how a woman feels. Imagine how soft and warm her skin feels. Imagine the sweet smell of her perfume.
Imagine her tenderly pressing her soft lips against yours. Imagine her letting you get on top of her and insert your inside her, softly moaning as it slides in. Imagine the walls of her tight, soft, warm wrapped around every inch of your. Imagine her breathing getting heavier with every thrust. Imagine her wrapping her arms and legs around you, holding you as close as she possibly can, and begging you to inside her as you release every ounce of your into her. Then imagine the feeling of pure satisfaction and peace that comes afterwards, and looking beside you to see a person that cares about you and has accepted you in the most intimate way possible. You will never get to experience this, because your skeleton is too small, or the bones in your face are not the proper shape. Have a nice day.
Now, compare and contrast with this EJMR post.
The snubby posts on this forum are getting out of hand. So many people post about how crappy certain journals are, how low-ranked certain departments are, and how easy it is to get tenure at shitty schools. But WTF, do you losers know? Most of you are only in grad school. Who knows if you'll even get placed in academia? Trust me when I say this. Those of you who are knocking journals that aren't top 5 or top field pubs will probably never publish in a top 5 and will have a lot of trouble publishing in top field. Most of you will also never get placed at a place you would consider decent, and you'll certainly end up getting tenure, if anywhere, at a place you might think is below you. The profession is much harder than you think, and 99% of people down the ranks their entire career. I'm an AP at a non-top 50 school right now, which most likely I'll get denied tenure in a few years and have to move on to a teaching college. I got my PhD at a top 15 and did my undergrad at an Ivy. Most of my colleagues have the same pedigree, but that doesn't mean we move up in the profession the way you all think you will. Moral of the story, knock journals and departments after you get a job and or tenure. Until then, GTFO.
The EJMR post is less directly creepy, and there's an element of trying to push against the hierarchy in economics. But the takeaway is ultimately the same. You are a loser, and it's time to accept that. There are fairly frequent reminders on the forum that most EJMR posters are in fact themselves low-ranked monkeys, lest anybody get carried away. There is, in other words, a lot of self-hatred on the forum. Economist Ben Harrell calls the realization that you won't get into the upper echelons of the discipline the economic red pill, much like the incel red pill of realizing you'll never get laid. And it has similar effects, leading to the blaming of women and minorities who have displaced you. In some ways, the analogy with incels is not really an analogy at all. It's not uncommon to find words like alpha, beta, and simp repeated on EJMR, the same terms used by incels and the broader so-called manosphere. Nor is it uncommon to see posts complaining about not being able to get a girlfriend, or otherwise complaining about women in some way.
If I can't get a girlfriend, there's no point to any of this. Why bother?
Where do you meet attractive, intelligent women these days? It was hard enough before COVID. I am talking 130 plus IQ.
My GF was a whore before she met me. She is 33 and wants to get married, thinks the world of me, but had sex with lots of guys before me. I've only had 3 partners total. A party of me wants to dump her for per this, but the other part of me knows what I'm looking for is a unicorn. Not sure what to do.
In fairness, you can see this last one was downvoted with 4 gerbs and 12 no gerbs, and there are some comments criticising the original poster, so there is hope. One especially sad post is titled, "No friends, no girlfriend, no talent and motivation for research." Though posted 7 years ago, it regularly gets bumped up with people saying they feel similar. The economist Alice Wu looked into the issue of misogyny on EJMR. Wu found that posts about women are 43% less likely to contain professional words like career, tenure, professor, or Keynesian. They are 192% more likely to contain personal words such as kids, beautiful, sexual, and fat. I wonder why women don't like economics. Some may argue that the overwhelming majority of the incel movement have objectively not had sex. EJMR, on the other hand, contains successful economists as well as unsuccessful ones, as can be verified by the amount of inside knowledge of top departments that gets displayed on the forum. While this is probably true, it doesn't get to the heart of the problem. As ContraPoints concludes, inceldom is as much a state of mind as it is an objective fact.
That the truth about incels is that almost all of them are completely normal-looking guys. But of course, that's not the feedback they get from other incels.
There is basically nothing wrong with most incels. They're just normal guys who have bought into the idea they'll never get laid. In the same way, within a discipline as toxic and competitive as economics, anyone can feel like a loser. Martin Weitzman, who we discussed at the beginning of the video, is a case in point. To remind you,
colleagues said that Professor Weitzman had grown increasingly despondent after being passed over for the Nobel Prize in Economics last year, and had left a note questioning whether he any longer had the mental acuity to contribute to his field.
One key moment, as recalled by his colleagues, was when a paper of his was corrected by a fellow economist.
Colleagues said that Professor Weitzman had been despondent after he did not win the Nobel, and that his emotional state worsened in the spring when, in a rare instance in his career, fellow economists pointed out a mistake in a completed but unpublished paper that Professor Weitzman had circulated. In a typewritten note that was found after his death, Professor Weitzman said his capacity to solve the kinds of difficult problems to which he had devoted his career was diminishing.
In the USA, rates of mental health problems are 3 times higher among economics graduate students than among graduate students in general. Only 26% of economics graduate students feel their work is useful, compared to 63% of the working age population. Despite being one of the pioneers of his field and Nobel Prize adjacent, Weitzman was made to feel like a failure because of the atmosphere of the discipline. For this reason, although EJMR is quite extreme, I wouldn't regard it as special. The tendencies and environment on EJMR are just an exaggerated version of what's going on in the discipline all the time. Denigration of other fields and non-mainstream economists, marginalisation of women and minorities, and general nastiness and gatekeeping around who counts as an economist or what counts as economics are embedded into the fabric of the discipline. We therefore have to ask not what to do about EJMR, but why EJMR exists in the first place. According to Jim Campbell, the answer is that young economists are drawn to it precisely because the process of getting a job in economics is so brutal, competitive, and opaque that they need to find some information somewhere. The name Economics Job Market Rumours is a clue. There is information on the forum and some of it is useful, or at least better than the nothing that many graduate students get from elsewhere in the profession. I've also seen the argument made that EJMR is a good way for young economists to hold the profession accountable without fear of backlash from powerful actors because of the anonymity. It is genuinely the case that EJMR has exposed academic fraud and wrongdoing on a number of occasions. For example, a paper published in a top 5 journal was found to have been ripped off from an older paper without crediting it by the people at EJMR. But as I said of economics seminars, there are ways of doing things. Holding some people accountable does not justify the misogyny, abuse, and toxicity of the forum. You know, drunk driving may kill a lot of people, but it also helps a lot of people get to work on time, so it's impossible to say if it's bad or not. Jim Campbell has described EJMR.
Like a person who treats waitstaff as subhuman, it is a callous manifestation of the insecurity of the wannabe, who feels that they must display their superiority by belittling others.
In one incident in 2020, when the Black Lives Matter protests were at their height, EJMR posters doxed and threatened graduate economics students from Berkeley, California, for signing an open letter against racism within the profession. Calling out hierarchies and inequalities in your discipline only seems to extend so far for some people. I actually did a video on race and economics around this time if you want to go and check that out. By the way, it also involves the Journal of Political Economy. More recently, EJMR, as well as others within the discipline, have tried to block the appointment of Lisa Cook. John Cochrane, an economist at Stanford University's Hoover Institute, claimed that Cook is appropriate only if the job is to bring the administration and progressive supporters' racial policies to the Fed. How do we improve the culture within the discipline to help extinguish this problem at the source? Unless you look like my producer, we've all had the experience of perpetual rejection in romance. And unless you look like Darren Acemoglu, we've all had the experience of perpetual rejection in journals. But there's a simple lesson here. When you find yourself in a toxic culture which makes you feel like shit, there are two ways to react. The first is to spray hatred at people who you perceive as inferior to you according to the culture's own standards, making yourself feel better as you desperately try to claw your way to the top. The second is to reject that culture and open up, becoming more sympathetic and open-minded towards the failure of others as well as yourself, and criticizing the toxic tendencies that you see. In a way, the former is the easy way out. It saves you the difficult job of thinking, of changing your behavior, of challenging those in power, and of course of expressing emotions, other than anger. One example of this in the context of masculinity is the Dudes Rock movement, which tries to celebrate the positive aspects of masculinity rather than reinforcing them or simply shitting on men. There are some positive signs within the discipline of economics. There are an increasing number of papers published reflecting on the toxic culture in economics, many of which I've discussed already. Another especially valuable paper in 2019 interviewed minority groups in economics and offered advice for those of us trying to improve things. This includes more communication and engagement with these groups, mentoring, and calling out discrimination. There is also a role for self-education, including a more critical perspective on what is taught and practiced within economics, which can broaden the field to bring in people from other backgrounds. Economics Twitter is an online presence of economists which is generally much more constructive and supportive than places like EJMR. EJMR actually really hate Econ Twitter and often speak of denying the people on their jobs, tenure and the like. Obviously, individual action won't be enough, and the major institutions in the discipline need to do more. The American Economic Association have pursued some half-hearted policies to reduce sexism and racism within the discipline. They also produced an ill-fated alternative to EJMR. These efforts need to be pursued much more vigorously. Jim Campbell has called for more systematic transparency and release of information about jobs which would make EJMR redundant. Giving more support to graduate students would stop them having to go there in the first place. Better accountability mechanisms for those with power could mean that people would be called out for bad behaviour formally, while protecting those who did so. Recommending changes in culture always feels a bit vague and abstract, but we need a broader culture shift within economics. Changing what it means to be an economist is the best way to reduce the toxicity within the discipline. If it is no longer the case that only certain journals and schools are valued, then those outside them will not feel inferior. If it is no longer the case that only certain methods are prized as real economics, then there will be less gatekeeping. If the field becomes less dominated by white men, this can help create a virtuous spiral where others face less discrimination. Essentially, a more open and intellectually diverse discipline would mean less policing of who belongs in economics. Perhaps if that were the case, we would have an economics which better served both those inside and those outside the discipline. Thank you everybody for listening to this video. It's a little bit different from some of my recent stuff, which was more policy oriented, but it's a topic that's so close to my heart, and I've actually been planning to do this video basically since I started my YouTube channel. So I know it was quite focused on a discipline and you know, on academia, things that you might not be too familiar with, but hopefully it was interesting, mostly because of the ridiculous email threads and emails and forum posts. I'm sure lots of this kind of toxicity is not necessarily unique to economics. I think economics has some unique features which make it worth talking about and interesting. But I would really love to hear about your own professions. If you're an academic, you know, your own discipline. I'm sure people have plenty of stories. You know, in the private sector, the public sector, there's a lot of toxicity and competitiveness out there. And I would love to hear some more about that in the comments. So yeah, thank you to my patrons as usual. And thanks very much to Ben Harrell, who was mentioned in the video and who took a look at a draft of this for some really valuable feedback. Thanks to my producer, Hobbie. And one other thing that I want to say is there's something that I saw this morning. Honestly, the examples in economics come too thick and fast for me to include everything. There's something this morning. It was an exam at the University of Chicago, right? And you may, if you follow economics debates, you may know that there's been a lot of talk about inflation recently. I did actually a video with the channel Money and Macro on inflation, and I'm going to be streaming this evening, which is going to be in the past with him. But you can probably be able to see that stream as well. We'll link the stream. We'll link the video if you want to know more about inflation. But anyway, let me just read out this exam question. It is absolutely ridiculous. An economist at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Bernie's favorite institution of higher education, wrote an op-ed column on December 30th arguing that to tackle our current 40-year high bout with rising price levels, brackets, an Econ 102 topic to be sure, brackets, we have a powerful weapon to fight inflation, price controls. How would a real economist respond? That is an actual exam question. How would a real economist respond? So if you're doubting the gatekeeping at the University of Chicago, then there you go. Literally asked to students. Obviously completely inappropriate for a formal exam. And by the way, this is Alan Sanderson, who has a reputation as basically being a bit of a dickhead. And he has also been implicated as a bit of a sex pest. There's been some reports from Claudia Salm's blog post. She didn't name him, but a bunch of University of Chicago undergraduates were reading over the blog post, and they were saying, oh, I wonder who this is, and saying it's obviously Sanderson. So he has a bit of a reputation. Gatekeeping and misogyny go hand in hand, as I tried to argue in the video. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'll see you next time where, well, as my plan right now is that I'm going to be talking about Jordan Peterson. So it's only taken, 12 videos? I had to talk about him and do an impression of him. See you later.
Like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe.
Love the outro, buddy.